Good evening.
Good evening.
You will all have the opportunity of studying these tapes, particularly the students here in Chicago. You will all have the opportunity of studying these tapes, and you will find them very valuable, the tapes of this series. The reason is that on the first evening, we had a resume of some of the very important principles that constitute really our healing work. That is, the principles used in treatment, in our understanding of that which brings about healing. And in the remaining of these lectures, including this evening, we have some of the barriers that delay or prevent demonstration. There is no doubt that all of us in our humanhood are made up of backgrounds, and it's very difficult for us to shake our backgrounds. We carry with us all through this experience many of our racial traits or national traits, and certainly we carry many of the religious teachings with which we've grown up. And some of these, of course, are our blessings. Others constitute barriers to our development. Tonight I would like to talk about one of these, because I wouldn't be surprised if this one is the biggest barrier in our entire experience. The other evening I thought perhaps that personalizing evil might be the biggest barrier to our spiritual development, but today it is clear to me that it isn't. It's very close to it. But this one that we will talk about this evening is, without any doubt, the one barrier to all harmony, to all spiritual demonstration. The principle that you will hear tonight is one that is to be found in no religious teaching on the face of the earth except the infinite way. And that is what makes it difficult. We have no background for it. It doesn't exist anywhere in our past. We have never heard of it as a principle. We have never used it as a principle. And perhaps even with our studies of this message, we haven't read it. The entire religious world is dedicated to the belief that there is a power called God, and that this power can be utilized to overcome or destroy error, evil, sin, disease, death. There isn't a religious teaching that doesn't turn to God for the purpose of having God do something to these evils, or for the purpose of using God or praying to God to be a power over sin, disease, death, lack, limitation, and even to establish peace on earth. All over the world, religious groups of every nature assemble to pray to God to establish peace on earth. And that reminds me, of the man in the divorce case when the attorney asked him the question, "When did you stop beating your wife?" The man is in a dilemma. He didn't beat his wife, but how is he going to answer that question, when? When you pray to God to establish peace on earth, you are virtually saying you aren't doing it now. When will you begin to have peace on earth? Why are you allowing wars on earth? Why don't you start to let us have peace? In other words, you're drawing a severe indictment against God when you ask him to have peace on earth, because you're holding him responsible for war on earth. And that's a terrible God, an awful God, responsible for war. When you pray to God to have your diseases healed, you must be saying, of course you know I have this disease, I'm telling it to you. You aren't doing anything about it, and now I'm asking you, I'm praying to you. Of course, God doesn't do it today. Maybe you will pray again tomorrow. You are drawing an indictment against God. He is responsible for your ills, or at least he is responsible for your not being healthy, because your very prayer indicates that you believe God has the power to give you health. And God isn't doing it. Now just think of this, that whether you are doing it consciously or unconsciously or subconsciously, you are actually holding in your mind the belief that there is a God that has power to heal you, a God who can give peace on earth, a God that can stop depressions, a God that can stop sin. If this were true, don't you know that wouldn't be God? There is no God to turn to for the healing of sin, disease, death, lack, limitation, wars, or depressions. Why isn't there? Because God is infinite. Because God is omnipotent. Now just a minute there. Let's stop for a second. God is infinite. Have you any idea of the meaning of the word infinite? The word infinity? If God is infinite, there is nothing besides God. Now, do you want to change your idea about God and say, well, now, God can't be infinite because there is sin, disease, and death, and thereby wipe out God? Or does something inside of you say, God is infinite? In spite of all appearances, God is infinite. That's a question that has to be answered inside your own heart. That has to be a secret between you and your inner religious conviction. Which will you choose for yourself? Which seems reasonable to you? A God that is not infinite, and therefore there is something beside God. A God that is not omnipotence, and therefore there is another power. How do you like that one? God is not omnipotence, therefore there is another power. Well, if God isn't omnipotence, maybe it isn't enough of a power to wipe out the one we're thinking about. We get more involved all the time, don't we? Unless we determine, no, something sings inside of me and says God is omnipotence. Omnipotence, all power, only power, the all power, the only power, the infinite power. If God is omnipotence, do you need any God to stop wars or heal disease? Or do you have to awaken? That word strikes a note, doesn't it? Reminds us of the Master. Awake, thou that sleepest, and Christ will give thee light. Awake, thou that sleepest. Is it necessary, then, that we stop turning to God and turn to ourselves and awaken? And awaken to the fact that God is omnipotence and that beside God there is none else? It would take many hours of instruction on the subject of the human mind to show you why the human mind has built up a belief in two powers, and therefore we are looking for a power to destroy these other powers. And that it is only in the human mind that the belief in two powers exists. In other words, in truth, in spiritual consciousness, in reality, there is only one power. I am the power, I am the way, I am dominion, I am the resurrection, I am life eternal, I am the bread, the meat, the wine, the water. This is spoken out from spiritual consciousness, from spiritual awareness. But the human mind says, give me bread, give me wine, give me water, give me resurrection, give me life eternal, give me harmony, give me peace. But the spiritual consciousness says, my peace give I unto you. Now, I cannot, even in the limits of a closed class, reveal to you the entire secret of the human mind. But I can tell you this. that the sins of the world and the diseases of the world and the fears of the world and the wars of the world and the greed and the lust and the envy and the malice and the jealousy only exist in the human mind and nowhere else. They weren't in this room until we came in. And they aren't out in the woods or by the lake until some human being goes down and takes them there. The human mind contains the belief in good and evil. Therefore, when the Master says, I have overcome the world, he is saying, I have overcome the belief in two powers. I see now that God in the midst of me is the only power, and so I can say to you, resist not evil. Put up thy sword. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. Why? Because they are the believer in two powers. Resist not evil. The Master would not have taught resist not evil if he thought that evil would do something to us. He was so positive of the impossibility of evil doing anything or being anything that he could say, resist not evil, put up thy sword. These revelations that were given to me, which constitute the message of the infinite way, was not a new means of healing sin, disease, and death. It was not a new mode of metaphysical practice, nor was it an old one dressed up. It was a clear-cut revelation of the truth that God alone is power, and that we, through accepting the universal belief in two powers, we cause our own distresses. Now, the belief in two powers isn't yours or mine. It's not personal. You didn't start it, and you can't end it. You can be the beginning of the age in which it is ended, in proportion as you can demonstrate it. If we, as a small group of students, small group in this city and a small group in another, a small group in another country, and then still another country and another country, if we could prove by our lives that ye need not fear a man whose breath is in his nostril, that you need not fear what mortal man can do to you, that you need not fear germs, infection, contagion, heredity, that you need not fear any circumstance or condition, even the one calling itself Pilate. Pilate, the greatest temporal power in the nation. Thou couldst have no power over me unless it were given thee of God. Or the Hebrew Hezekiah. The army coming against us is twice as great as we are, heavily armed. And Hezekiah says, they have but the arm of flesh. And they rested in his word, and the enemy destroyed itself. They rested in his word. When you can stop trying to use God, which somehow reminds me of a little fellow my size swinging an elephant around by the tail, we using God. When you can stop trying to use God, influence God, coerce God, bribe God, beg, plead with God, when you can stop this and say, oh, I'm sure God's in his heaven and all's well with the world, awake, thou that sleepest, and see that there's only one power. See that there's only one cause. See that life is eternal. Not that Jesus is going to make it eternal, or you or me or a book of truth. Nothing can make life what it isn't, for life is God, and it can only be what it is. And it is eternal, and it is immortal. You can know this truth and demonstrate it, or you can be in ignorance of this truth and fail to demonstrate it, but you can't make life eternal, and you can't make anyone healthy, for health is a condition of eternal life. Health is a condition of divine mind. Health is a condition of the spirit of man. You can know this truth and bring it into manifestation, but you can't make it true. It is true. You can awaken to the realization, what did hinder you? What did hinder you? Are there two powers? Is Satan a power? Is carnal mind a power? Is mortal mind a power? Or are these just names meaning the arm of flesh or nothingness? You see, when you visualize Jesus in the wilderness and the devil standing in front of him, tempting him 3 times, that devil looks pretty powerful. But after Jesus has said no 3 times, what becomes of the devil? You don't hear of him anymore. He's finished his scene in this play, and he's dissolved. Ah, yes, but it took Jesus to say no. Had he said yes, the devil would have really had power. No, he really wouldn't have had power. It would have been Jesus saying yes that gave him power. Of himself, the devil can only be a tempter. But the temptation is aimed at us. And we are the ones who can say yes or no. If we say no, that ends the work of the tempter. And the tempter's finished. Paul erroneously said, the carnal mind is enmity against God. And if you study the life of God, you'll find that Paul demonstrated it too. There wasn't a week in which he wasn't beaten or thrown in prison or starved. And that's the way he ended up too. Fighting carnal mind. Fighting non-existent power. Of course, all he did was hit himself in the face. The carnal mind isn't enmity against God. The carnal mind is a name given to a universal belief in 2 powers. And when you recognize that, you've dissolved carnal mind. There cannot be 2 minds. We know there's one, and that must be the only one there is. And so when we say carnal mind, or when we say mortal mind, all we're saying is the arm of flesh, nothingness. Now, just to test yourselves, watch. Every time that you either see or hear some phase of error, and see if your mind doesn't jump up instantly to refute it, deny it, rebel against it, answer it. And you see that you're using your mind as a power. And the minute you use your mind as a power, you're licked. You might as well give up and ask somebody for help because you can't do it. The moment that mind goes up as a defense, do you notice that when some dust flies in front of your eyes, or fly or mosquito, that instantly your eyes blink? Well, of course, that's their defense against anything blowing in. And you just watch yourself whenever you see or hear some phase of discord, and see if your mind doesn't instantly jump up and try to act as a defense, deny it, refute it, cast it out. And by that token, you have admitted it. You have to learn to see and hear every phase of error, individual or collective, in the same way that you look at that roaring stream of water on the road in the desert, smiling to yourself and saying, mirage. Now you notice that you don't have a mental defense against that mirage. You just look at it and smile and say mirage. The person who doesn't know about mirage, they not only slow their mind up, they also slow their automobile up. They are going to find out what we can do about this water, which of course all the time you know isn't water, is mirage. So it is, your spiritual healer does not turn to God for healing. He may turn to God for illumination, may turn to God for conscious contact, may turn to God for inner light and wisdom, but never for healing, because that would be indicting God right away with blame. God, if you didn't cause this disease, except indeed you must know about it, and knowing about it, you aren't doing anything about it. And that's an indictment. As a matter of fact, it shows how much more loving you are than God, because in your love you would heal this disease, but God, he just keeps on ignoring it. Can't be true, can it? No, it isn't any more true than the water on the road, which is mirage. That isn't true either. But you sitting there, knowing that, you don't turn to God. You don't even jump out to look for pails to remove the water. You just sit there quietly and say, drive on, drive on. So your spiritual healer must say, let's go forward, let's go forward, let's go forward. Keep going. What did hinder you? There are no other powers. There are no other powers. There is a God power, but it won't do anything to sin, disease, and death, because there isn't any sin, disease, and death. These are the illusions of the human mind that has two powers. God power is the power that is always evolving as form, appearing as the universe, you and me, and maintaining and sustaining that universe eternally. That's the power of God. God is always about God's business, evolving as individual, you and me, and maintaining that image and likeness throughout eternity. Before Abraham was, you and I have coexisted with God, and we will go right on coexisting unto the end of time. So there's no such thing as birth or death. These are all parts of the mirage of human experience. But as long as you can be tempted to believe in two powers, you will fight against the devil. and you'll fight against war, and you'll fight against disease, and you'll fight against sin. You'll fight against error of every kind, and in the end you'll lose. Well, the world always has. All the thousands of years of recorded history, nobody has ended wars yet, because they've always tried to end them with more power than they had in the last war. And that leads to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. There have been 5, 6, 7,000 years of recorded history. Nobody's ever ended wars. There's been at least that many years of recorded disease and sin. Nobody's ended them. And the same sins that are mentioned in the Bible 2000 B.C. are the same ones that are filling the hospitals and jails today. Nobody's ended those. They've been fighting them. Been fighting them and punishing us for them. The Master didn't. The Master said, "Neither do I condemn thee." He warned, go and sin no more. Why? Well, because you're suffering now from the belief in two powers, pleasure and pain, and I'm freeing you of that. But go right back to the belief in pleasure and pain again, and you'll suffer the same thing over or worse. It won't be God doing it, it'll be you doing it. In the same way that we say, your spiritual practitioner can heal you, at least 99% of you, but they can't prevent you getting sick next week again. Only you can do that by a change of consciousness. A person in the same consciousness today as they had yesterday will demonstrate the same outer effects. In other words, all that we are ever externalizing is a state of consciousness. So in order to change the externalization, we have to change the state of consciousness. Therefore, it is not difficult to be healed, it is difficult to stay well. And the reason is that only to a limited extent can the practitioners do that for you. In other words, students of a teaching like the Infinite Way, I mean students who, we will say, are in this message 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, all can show that after the first year or two, their problems lessened. Problems of health, problems of supply, and that they not only stay lessened, but they continue to lessen. This is partly due to their own study and practice, but to a great extent to the fact that they have become a part of a united spiritual consciousness. And therefore, the group consciousness maintains the individuals who themselves are not able to maintain themselves. In other words, I, if I be lifted up, can draw all men unto me. So that if we were to have just 1,000 good, serious, earnest, working students, I don't mean practitioners, I mean good, honest, earnest, working students, that 1,000 students could keep 50 to 100,000 students in better health than they had ever known before, with less problems, with less lack. But that would not lessen the responsibility of every one of those 50,000, because sooner or later they too must join the ranks and develop their own state of consciousness. Now, one of the barriers then, and I wouldn't be surprised that this is the most serious barrier of all to spiritual progress, is the fact that our students, many of them, are still thinking of God as a big power that's going to do something to the little powers called sin, disease, and death. They still turn to God, thinking God is going to do something for them. They still turn to God as if God could do something today that God wasn't doing yesterday, or that God could do something for you or me that God isn't doing for all mankind. In other words, God is no respecter of persons. There's no such thing as one person deserving more of God than another person. His rain falls on the just and on the unjust. The whole of the Christ teaching is that we must forgive 70 times 7. That must put it up to God to forgive 70 times 70 times 70 times 7. So therefore, in God there is no punishment. In God there is no lack of harmony. Therefore, punishment, lack of harmony, sin, disease, death exist in us, not in God. And they only exist in us to the extent that we believe in two powers. And the nearer we can come to the Master's resist not evil, the closer we can come to seeing and hearing error and inside smiling. Don't offend anyone outside by laughing at them, but inside smiling. I know thee who thou art. The arm of flesh, nothing. And then go on without denial, without refuting, without trying to use this mind to overthrow evil. Resting, relaxing in this word. God is. God is. Why, do you know that to correctly understand the 23rd Psalm would change the life of everybody on earth? I don't mean to recite it the way it's recited ordinarily. I don't even mean to believe it the way it's believed. I mean to take it apart like we do in that pamphlet, The Secret of the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Well, isn't that nice? We can relax. We don't have to reach out for God. Now think of that. Just think of the miracle of that first sentence. We don't have to reach out for God. Why? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Isn't that nice to know? Relax, turn over and go to sleep. He leadeth me beside the still waters. What? Without begging, pleading, affirming, denying? Without pulling him down out of heaven? Without lighting candles? That's what it says there. He leadeth me beside the still waters of his own volition. Oh, the next one is a wow. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He takes me by the back of the neck and forces me to lie down in green pastures. And it's true, I'm resisting him. I really am resisting. All of the time we're resisting God. We are resisting God because we refuse to take the first sentence and believe it. The Lord is. The Lord is. Why now am I worried? Why now am I concerned? Because I don't think the Lord is all power. That's the reason. I don't think the Lord is omnipotent. That's the reason. I don't think the Lord is omnipresent. I don't think the Lord is closer to me than breathing and nearer than hands and feet. I don't think the Lord knows his business. I think he's letting the earth slip away from him. It's all nonsense, isn't it, when you hear it that way? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leadeth me beside the still waters, maketh me to lie down in green pastures. Yea, if I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Now, why shouldn't you fear evil when you're walking through the valley of the shadow? Because God is there. Well, but God means life eternal. Oh, well, that makes a new picture too, doesn't it? God is life eternal. Well, how can you fear death? How can you fear death in life eternal? And so it is, then, that you will come to see why this infinite way has spread around the world as it has, without promotion, without advertising, without organization. It doesn't need it. It has a basic truth which has done miracles in the lives of people. This basic truth of God is. God is, and let God reign. Let the kingdom of God be on earth as it is in heaven. Don't force it. Don't use mental force or physical force. Relax from mental powers and physical powers. Relax. God is, that's enough. It would be a sad world if God isn't. But then if God isn't, there's no use of us working so hard about anything either, because we aren't going anyplace. But God is. And once we have that inner conviction, God is. And He's not my God or your God. He's not the God of the Hebrews or the God of the Christians. Heaven's sakes, there isn't a pagan on earth or an atheist on earth that isn't as valuable in the sight of God as the most religious man or woman that ever trod the earth. How can God be a respecter of persons? That couldn't be God. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. God is from everlasting to everlasting, and His reign falls on the just and the unjust. And the very moment that we begin to realize, ye need not fight, the battle is not yours. Not the physical battle and not the mental battle. This is the thing that's keeping us in bondage, the mind. Because the mind is made up of two powers. And it's always seeing good or seeing evil. It's always believing good or believing evil. And when it creates good and it creates evil also. But when the mind is still, when it doesn't refute, when it doesn't deny, then you can look through the appearance. And then you can say, that's quite different. That is quite different. The very moment you feel that mental defense go up, that mental denial, that mental affirmation, you're in the squirrel cage, going round and round and round and round. If you can teach yourself to awaken to the realization of God as infinity, omnipotence, omnipresence, you no longer have the belief of good and evil. Because in the presence of infinity, there's no opposite. In the presence of omnipotence, there's no opposite. That is why you can always know that mental work isn't really prayer. Sometimes it's used as a synonym for prayer, but it isn't, because mental work can be good or evil. Mental work is an activity of the mind. It's an activity of thought. And I don't have to tell you that the purest man or woman on earth has both good thoughts and bad thoughts. They can't all be pure, because the mind itself is a divided mind. It's divided against itself. And it's comprised of good and evil. And therefore, when you're doing mental work, you're not doing spiritual work, and you're not praying, and you're not in heaven. It is when you are not doing mental work, when you are not denying, and when you are not affirming, But when you are resting in the assurance, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Thy grace is my sufficiency in all things. In thy presence is fullness of life. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. This isn't mental work. This is bringing back to conscious remembrance the basic truth of Scripture of all time. That's not mental work. You're not doing it for a reason. You're not doing it to make evil disappear. You're not doing it to treat away sin or disease. You are doing it only to bring back to conscious remembrance some of the great beauties that have slipped away from you. And so you repeat to yourself, the Lord is my shepherd, or in thy presence is fullness of joy. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Where God is, I am. Any assurance that you can bring back to conscious remembrance will keep you from doing mental work to destroy a sin or a disease or a death or a lack or a limitation. Any of the promises of Scripture, of the Master, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. I will be with thee unto the end of the world. I, in the midst of thee, am mighty. I am thy bread and thy wine and thy water. I am thy resurrection. I am thy life eternal. Any of these remembrances are for your inner assurance and peace. They are not aimed at destroying sin, disease, or death or war. And they help quiet you to where you can become receptive and really hear the voice of God say, fear not, it is I. And those are the words that set us free from all of the discords of human life. Just those, fear not, it is I. In other words, there is only one I. There is only one God. There is only one power. There is only one being. There is only one presence. So fear not. If there's only one, I am that one. Fear not. It is I. And I am omnipotence and omniscience and omnipresence. Therefore, there's no opposites. Nothing to protect oneself from. Nothing to fear. Nothing to hate. Nothing to overcome. Nothing to get rid of. Do you see why it's difficult? Because not in your Orthodox religion and not in your metaphysical religion have you ever worked from the standpoint that there's nothing to work about. Never have you worked from the standpoint that there aren't two powers, an immortal mind and a mortal mind, or a God and a devil, or a good with a capital G and an evil with a capital E. Always there are two powers, and always you're reaching for one to do something to the other. Instead of resting in this word, be not afraid. It is I. I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee. If you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will be with you. Fear not. Fear not what mortal man can do to thee. Fear not what mortal conditions can do to thee. Fear not, fear not, fear not. Think of little David going out against big Goliath. Well, the answer's clear. That big fellow with all his armor didn't have any power. None whatsoever. No power that a tiny little pebble wouldn't throw over. Jesus applying spittle to the blind man. The blindness didn't have any power that a little spittle couldn't take care of. And spittle isn't power. So you never need one power to overcome another power. And that's the message of the infinite way. You never need a power to overcome a power. The whole history of war, the whole history of medicine, all is built on one power overcoming another power. One power doing something to another power, but they go on for centuries and centuries and centuries. And our little problems, and big ones, they dissolve. And we don't have to wait centuries for them either. They dissolve quickly when we come to one of our students who isn't in fear of the big boogeyman, who isn't in fear of sin, doesn't get horror-stricken at it, isn't afraid of disease, isn't afraid of lack, even might suffer it for a while and still not fear it or hate it. Just realize, all right, this may be a temporary experience and it'll serve some good purpose when it's over, just as Joseph's experienced it, being thrown in the pit and sold into slavery and into prison. Tough experiences to go through at the time, but how valuable afterward. There has never been anyone, at least none that I've known or heard about, who has ever made a name for themselves in the metaphysical or spiritual world that hasn't come up out of terrible problems, awful ones, of disease or of sin or of lack. Every one of the big fellows and the big women have really had it hard at some time or other, and in proportion to the depth of their problem has been the height of their attainment. And it's natural. It's natural because anybody that has a reasonable amount of health and a reasonable amount of supply and a reasonable amount of sinlessness, they haven't got any incentive to work hard. They're getting along fine. They're doing well. And there's nothing to fight about. But those who have really been had two strikes on them, they're the ones who really gripped that bat and went to work. And they have attained something. If you have problems and they seem difficult, I won't go so far as to say rejoice about them, but at least recognize the fact that they are giving you an opportunity that the person down the street with no problem hasn't got. You have an incentive. Be grateful that you are being given principles, especially this one and the one of impersonalization, two principles not to be found anywhere, which when understood and practiced will change the whole nature of your life as it has mine and several other people that we know that have found the answer through these principles. There's no faith healing to this. There's no belief in a God doing something for us that it won't do for somebody else. There are no personal powers taught in the message of the infinite way. Nobody is taught as being gifted with more power than another. The teaching is that God is the only power and that these problems that face you of sin, disease, death, lack, limitation, individual or collective, these are to be understood as the arm of flesh or nothingness. These are the product of a universal hypnotism brought about by a belief in two powers. And as we purify ourselves inside, and there's no use trying to purify yourself by thinking good thoughts instead of bad thoughts. it doesn't work in the end. You may repress your bad thoughts for a little while, but don't worry, they'll break out in another place. Don't worry about those bad thoughts for a while. Be concerned about the incorrect thoughts. The fact that there aren't two powers, and that you're not going to use one power or seek for one power to overcome another power. Impersonalize the evil so that you never attach it to person. And then watch how these discords and inharmonies gradually disappear. Sometimes suddenly disappear. You see now why I said that I hope you will study seriously the tapes of this series. First, that the principles, the positive principles, be brought back frequently to your conscious remembrance. And then secondly, that you remember these specific points which may act as barriers to your progress. You may find yourself personalizing the evil and calling it Jones, Brown, or Smith, or my son, or my father, or my mother, or even my mother-in-law sometimes. But, on the other hand, if you're not making that mistake, you may still be making the mistake of believing, oh, if I could just get a hold of God, He would take care of this. Well, just believe me, if there was a God to take care of it, He'd be doing it without your intercession or mind. For God is love, and God is not waiting around for you or me to find the right posture in which to pray or the right combination of words, nor is God waiting around to see if you or I find the right practitioner. No, there's no such God. God is love. And God is omnipotence, and God is omniscience, and God is omnipresence. God is, and the Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not want. And if you'll only relax in the isness of God, you'll awaken out of this dream that you have to find a power of some kind. And you'll know that God is the only power there is. And that's our blessing on earth, as we will find it too in heaven. Thank you for the privilege of this beautiful week. Thank you, and I can't say any more because I guess you all know what's inside of me. If you've known me long enough, you ought to.